Hi, Dr. Faye. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. And I feel like at every podcast, I say the same thing. I am super excited to be here. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this amazing topic that so many of our kids, our teens, and even adults go through, which is eating difficulties, specifically in the area of ARFID. So
Yeah,
thank you.
and thank you for having me. I'm also really excited to talk about ARFID, which stands for Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder, and really affects a lot of people, kids, teens, and adults, and is not talked about as much. So I'm glad to lend a voice to that alongside, how it can show up with people who struggle with selective mutism as well.
That's awesome. And one of the things you just said is that it's not talked about as much as it should be. What do you think the reasons are for that?
A big part of that is it was always considered a developmental diagnosis and often looked at in infants and early childhood. And within the last 10 years, it started to be recognized as a diagnosis that persists beyond early infancy and childhood. So those kids that struggle with it early on typically grow up and continue to struggle with it. And just to kind of rewind a little bit, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder is a difficulty with eating that is not based on a desire to control weight or body image, but it's usually based on properties of the food or feared consequences of eating food, or maybe a lack of interest in food. And sometimes we think of those folks as extremely picky eaters. And you see it a lot in kids, and that's developmentally normal to an extent in kids. But when it starts to impact ability to function across really important domains like socially or getting adequate nutrition, it starts to really get out of control. And that's when you start to get a diagnosis like ARFID. And so, about 10 years ago, the manual that we use to diagnose psychological disorders, which is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, got updated. And they decided that ARFID actually is its own standalone diagnosis. And they moved it into the eating disorder section, whereas before it was considered more of a developmental diagnosis just for little kids. And so, with that move to the eating disorder section, it allowed people to start actually getting assessed and diagnosed. And now there's a lot more research and attention and awareness and discussion around it, but it's still in its infancy.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's awesome information. I was also thinking that the lack of awareness is also probably a challenge because people don't know necessarily what ARFID is. And we have the same thing with selective mutism. People don't always understand it. They may have heard the term, but they misunderstand it. So one of the goals for today, and I so appreciate, this information you're sharing, is to really clear it up. Like, what is ARFID, how it presents, how we can, treat it in many ways, how to differentiate it from other eating disorders.
Yeah. So ARFID right now is a little bit of a catch all for any kind of picky eating concern that is really impairing functioning to a significant degree or causing health difficulties. But there are three subcategories that sometimes people experience more than one, but often they're pretty distinct. One is a lack of interest in eating or food. And that's where people often don't find food to be very interesting. They don't necessarily find it to taste good. Sometimes they struggle with feeling full, and that can be overwhelming. And so they'll stop eating early on, and they might struggle to get adequate calories or nutrition or keep their weight up. The second category is people who struggle with sensory characteristics of food. And that's where they have issues with textures or smells or colors, or they have certain rules about food. Sometimes they'll only eat certain brands. Sometimes they'll have rules about whether food can touch. And it can start to look a little bit almost like obsessive compulsive disorder. And so sometimes it's more on the sensory side of things, but sometimes it evolves into rules that don't necessarily make sense to people who don't struggle with ARFID. And the treatment can look a little bit different for that category than it would for the first category. And then the third category is people who are afraid of consequences of eating. So they avoid food because they're afraid they might gag or choke or vomit. And sometimes that's just due to a fear in general, but sometimes that's due to previous past experiences that were pretty negative. And that might be because they've had medical issues that led them to vomit or choke on food. Sometimes they'll have gastrointestinal issues or allergies, especially in infancy, if there were allergies that cause those kinds of reactions that then led to fear or food avoidance. And kids can't say what's going on. They can't say that they're having an allergic reaction. They just know they're not going to eat that. And that can even be rejecting breast milk or difficulty transitioning from breastfeeding to solid foods. And that's usually when it starts to show up to parents of, okay, we need to really do something about this early on. But so those are three very different categories of what it can look like. And I think as we start to study it and look at it and learn about it, those might even evolve even further into the future about how we're even looking at those. Are they all the same thing? Should they all be treated the same way? And hopefully part of this discussion will be about whether, what makes sense for each of those things, tailoring to the individual need.
Well, it's interesting because, as I said, having picky eating challenges, sensitive eating challenges, however people want to see it, and now really talking about ARFID, this is something we see in this population. I talk about the quad a lot: eating, sleeping, behaviors, and toileting. And they often come together, but sometimes you have one or two of them. When we see this, especially at the more they have of that quad, the more there's a sensory relationship. I would say by far, the far majority of individuals with selective mutism that have eating issues, ARFID here we're talking about, are the sensory sensitive kids, where it's more the food textures, the tastes, just the sensory aspect. So what I'd like to do, and it doesn't mean that they don't have some of these other two avenues that you talked about with the lack of interest in eating and worrying about the negative consequences of choking and gagging. I'm not saying they don't exist. And like you said, maybe there's an overlap and one evolves to the next. But what I'd like to do is touch a little bit more about the sensory eating aspect to this. Like, what do you see in a child and a teen? How are they presenting and how do they live their life with that?
Similarly to your experience, the vast majority of the clients I work with are also clients that have that sensory element and a lot of food rules, but there seems to be this underlying feeling of disgust in reaction to food. And that's a big challenge. Disgust is different from anxiety because disgust is a very hardwired emotion that tells us something is dangerous. And especially when it comes to food, it's signaling that that food may be poisoned. And that's an evolutionary experience. So it makes sense that we would avoid foods that are experienced as disgusting. And there's a suggested component to this, that this is how people are built that struggle with ARFID. And it's not necessarily something we can change. They may always find certain foods to be disgusting, but there are different ways to approach it that can help alleviate some of that disgust. And sometimes by trying new foods, you do realize you like them, and maybe you've avoided things for so long that you didn't even realize you could like them. You were just afraid of it. But I want to acknowledge that folks who struggle with ARFID may have this built-in sensory sensitivity or textural sensitivity or just disgust reaction. And there is some research that suggests that a subset of folks who have ARFID may be super tasters, where they have a higher concentration of taste buds in certain areas and I'm talking a little bit outside of my, domain.
No, this is awesome though, because for me, I see these challenges that kids have because SM is so much more than not speaking and these different comorbidities and challenges. And so to hear you kind of go into more elaboration in this is such a benefit, frankly, to me, but also to our listeners.
And something that's really important to me is validating that experience is very real. And that we're not trying to ruin their lives by making them eat disgusting things so much as helping somebody work through feelings of disgust so that they can live a fuller life in a way that makes sense to their goals. And that's one of the reasons I really like working with teens and adults is they have a lot more agency and say in what their goals really are. But often the goals are not to love food or even like food. The goal is to be able to eat across different settings or to be able to eat a variety of foods so that they can get adequate nutrition and address any medical consequences of food. And so we're looking at what is the point of this? Is it to make them comfortable with food? To an extent, but it's more about if you are comfortable with eating food, what would that give you on a larger scale? And in terms of how this can shift with treatment, often people who have that sensory origin or that disgust reaction will be born that way. They are built that way. And then they start cutting out foods or they don't try foods. And one way of thinking about this is you often develop what you think tastes good based off of what you are exposed to, especially early on. So you look at cultural differences and what we find to be good foods and what do we eat. And people tend to prefer different spices and flavors that they grew up with because your palate adapts to that. So somebody might have a sensory sensitivity or a disgust reaction to certain foods, but then also if they're not exposed to foods, foods will taste more disgusting over time. And by practicing engaging with foods, sometimes you can dismantle some of those disgust reactions just through the experience and adapting your palate to those different kinds of foods.
So it's interesting you say disgust, because disgust for littler kids is not the biggest thing that I see. I just see kids avoiding certain foods and the kind of power struggle that exists with parents. They need to eat this much. They're not eating. They stopped eating. Now, as we know, developmentally, they change, right? Their nutritional needs change. So their high demand nutrition and eating a lot will change as they age. So I see that. So they don't, I'm wondering, and I'd love to hear your thought on this. And I'm just thinking outside the box here. I'm wondering if the word disgust comes about more as kids get older and it looks like disgust, but maybe it started out as a real sensitivity. Because in young children, I never hear that term. It's disgusting, mom. I never hear it, or I don't like. It's more of like, oh, it almost bothers them to eat it. So then
Yeah.
it turns into disgust. What's your thought on that?
I could see it going a lot of different directions, and I don't know the exact answer to that. And I don't know if it's a lack of language at
Yeah,
that stage or if it's something that, gets reinforced. And I think that there's both. I think
yeah,
some people, the more they avoid it, the more they have an association with it. And that's where the psychological therapy side of
yeah.
things can really help, because we counter condition some of those strong emotional reactions to the food that have built up over time. But also, there seems to be this for a lot of the clients that I work with, you'll just see this automatic disgust reaction where they'll bite into food and just look repulsed. And
Mm,
you can see they're fighting the urge to spit it out and they're fighting the urge to gag on it. And that's with adults and, older clients that I work with who are very aware of what they're doing. They are choosing to be there. They want to engage with that food. And a lot of times they'll go into it saying, yeah, I can totally do that. And then when they take the first bite, you just see that revulsion and they're like, oh, maybe I can't do this. What do I do with this? And sometimes it's the flavor, sometimes it's just the texture. I've worked with people who struggle with like bursting sensations when you bite into a food and it's bursting. And so we'll practice just biting into a grape and spitting it out and biting into a grape and spitting it out, just to work through that sensation of, okay, I can handle this. I do not like this. This is not my favorite, but I can totally handle this. And then feeling confident to be able to bite into things. And even if you have that disgust reaction or that revulsion, you can work through that feeling. And sometimes you can retrain that reaction. So that's where I'm wondering about your question of, is it something that develops over time? Some people can't retrain it, but some people I've worked with are able to kind of dial it down once they've gotten used to eating certain textures, even if they don't like them.
And so interesting, what I find with kids with sensory issues, there's a lot of children that might present, let's say 3, 4, 5, with a lot more sensory sensitivities, not just with eating, with other aspects of sensory sensitivities. They're often affected with visual processing, auditory processing. They get very, they shut down in loud, large, lots of people environments. And then I rarely have ever had a case where you have just the like kind of the loud, large, lots of people and not have picky eating. It all goes together. Picky eaters and also difficulty regulating emotions. So we see all that. But it's really interesting too, because as children age, I often say to some of the families, many of these kids are growing into their more immature sensory system. So the child at 3 or 4 or 5 may look very different at 7, 8, or 9. And some of those earlier sensory sensitivities and almost learned conditioned behaviors surrounding those originally more upsetting sensory sensitivities that cause them so much dysfunction aren't so much causing the dysfunction now, but they're learned behaviors, parents' learned reactions. So again, I wasn't necessarily planning to say all of this, but as you're talking to me, all these things pop into my head, you know, regarding my population. So with what I just said, does that make you think of anything? Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And I think that starts to be the question of, how is ARFID diagnostically? Is it its own thing? Are the subcategories something else? Are they related to other diagnoses? And I certainly work with a lot of folks who have other sensory sensitivities. And then it starts to become this broader question of, what else is happening? Is there something in the way that they're built in terms of how they're experiencing sensory information? Is there something in terms of like neurological mapping and how much real estate is being dedicated to each of those sensory modalities? And then trying to figure out how much should we be accommodating and helping somebody, you know, navigate and drown out in terms of sensory overload so that they can live a full life while accommodating that, versus how much should we be helping somebody work through it and push them to face some of these avoided experiences so that they can learn how to handle them. And I think it's always this fine line of working with the individual to figure out what their goals are, what are they hoping to get out of life, so that we're helping them go towards things that are helpful for them to go towards, and then accommodating things that might be helpful to accommodate as a kind person, helping them live through the world. I know that that was kind of a murky response, but I'm
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. But it's interesting for me. One of the lectures or workshops I do is selective mutism through the ages, because I see the 2.5, 3 year olds all the way up to, older adults. So to see how social communication changes over time, I imagine it's very similar when you're really, and I see it with like eating issues and how things change too. So I think it's just interesting to see kind of hear about those dynamics that on your end too. Before we get into the treatment, because obviously that's critical, and I know our listeners want to hear that, if you could, and you kind of touched on it for sure, a little bit more in detail on the consequences of untreated ARFID. Oh, he's going to grow out of it. She's going to grow out of it. Or she's just being stubborn. She needs to do this. And it goes years, because I see this with SM, right? Oh, she's going to grow out of it. She's just shy. You need to do this. You should do this. And that only reinforces avoidance and anxiety.
the biggest consequence is the medical consequence. A lot of people who struggle with ARFID come into my office because they're having nutritional issues or medical issues related to the eating. And that's the major thing that they want to address. And I think there is this idea of somebody with ARFID as being underweight because they're not eating enough. But often a lot of the people that I'm working with are overweight because the foods that they're comfortable with, and this is cross-cultural as well, the foods that they're comfortable with tend to be higher fat, higher calorie, more in like the junk food domain. And so if somebody's only living on chicken nuggets, which I would say like across the board, the thing people seem to come in only eating is chicken nuggets, but only chicken nuggets from their specific place, not chicken nuggets from anywhere else. And it has to be cooked a certain way and prepared by a certain person. So that's where we start to get into some of the rules that come with our food. But the biggest consequence is they're just not necessarily eating foods that are benefiting them nutritionally. And so especially with adults, I start to see people who've struggled with this their whole life, and now they have low bone density because they didn't get enough calcium growing up, or they didn't get enough dairy growing up. And maybe they have high cholesterol, or they're pre-diabetic or diabetic because a lot of the foods that they're eating are not necessarily, they're high calorie, and so they're overweight. And so we're looking at what are the medical consequences of not being able to have a nutritional variety in their diet. That's one of the biggest consequences. And especially with kids, what you'll see is a failure to make expected developmental gains. So either growth or weight gains, or they're spiking on certain nutritional issues in terms of like lab work. And that's where I really like to collaborate with a physician that can assess and tell me, what is this child's medical need? Do they need to gain weight? Do they need to lose weight? How quickly? Is that going to be healthy? How would you recommend going about that? How many calories a day do you think they need? So that I'm collaborating with people who can give me the input on what this child really needs. And then I can help them work through the emotional issues of that. And same with teens and adults. But also I'd like to work with a dietitian or a nutritionist that can help me inform the specific needs that somebody has. So then we're taking the meal plan and we're working through challenges that incorporate those things that are going to give them the best health picture. The other major consequence that tends to show up is the social consequence, which is a fear of engaging in different situations where they might not be able to eat, or they might not be able to find the food that they're comfortable with, or that people might notice that they're struggling and then they'll think they're weird or they'll judge them. And it can get really, really hard. And so that's when I usually start to see kids getting buy-in for treatment. Usually when it's younger kids, it's parents that are like, something has to change. Whereas a kid would love to eat chicken nuggets all day and doesn't see a problem with that particular issue. But when they start to get older and they realize, I can't go to sleepovers, I can't go to birthday parties and eat the cake, and everybody's going to notice I'm not eating the cake. And it's really stressful for me to try to eat the cake. And then they're going to see that I'm struggling and I'm crying, and that's embarrassing. That's a major consequence. And with adults, I really see that on people not being able to go on dates and they really want to date. And so that social piece is usually another major consequence.
Yeah, that's all super interesting. You know, a large percentage of individuals with selective mutism have social anxiety. I don't necessarily see ARFID as part of that because sometimes they have, the inability, they have difficulty eating in front of others from their social anxiety. But when they are in a comfortable environment, like at home or even a comfortable restaurant, they don't have difficulties. So I definitely think it's important for our listeners to understand that maybe what differentiates it is not so much the social anxiety, but the sensory aspect here. Because I do know that kids, that individuals, not just kids, with selective mutism and the social anxiety and the sensory all come together. But it's the sensory piece that I see the most in my practice, for sure. So this is just really interesting because of that social, aspect, the consequences that you're talking about. I could see that even being more of an issue for our socially anxious kids and teens and adults. The more
Yeah.
socially anxious, the more they're going to be so aware of all of this. So that probably just makes it even bigger of an issue.
Yeah, it starts to have a real ripple effect. And usually those are the moments when people start to say, okay, I'd like to work through this. I don't want to deal with things that are disgusting, but I want to be able to live a full life. And this is getting in the way of being able to travel and go out and go to camp and go to parties and all that stuff.
So let's dive into treatment. And I know you talk a lot about the CBT and the exposure. So I'm going to let you lead this section because if this is what you do. So when you have a parent come in with a child, with a teen and adult, what are the steps?
The good news is there's not one size fits all, and there are a few different ways to approach this. And I think that sensory element is really interesting because there are kind of different presentations, there are different treatments that have developed in different arenas of treatment beyond just psychology. So one route is looking at occupational therapy. An occupational therapist often helps kids and, teens and adults work through the sensory components of feeling overloaded by certain sensory information and sensory sensitivities. And that can include food. For younger kids, like infants and young children, feeding clinics are often a really great space to look for treatment because they're collaborating with a team of nutritionists and medical physicians, but also potentially speech therapists that are looking at how is your mouth shaped? How are you chewing food? So they can look at the muscle part and the structural part. But then when you start to get older, that's where the question of what is treatment, how do you do this, starts to get a little bit murkier. And in the psychological world, there's kind of two different domains that have developed. One is the eating disorder world, which most people look at first because ARFID is considered an eating disorder. So that makes sense. Naturally, you look for an eating disorder therapist. And that can be a great route. But sometimes eating disorder treatment is very focused on what are considered the more traditional, more well known eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia and binge eating disorder that have a very different relationship with food and often involve a desire to change body weight or shape and self worth related to self image and food as a part of that experience. Whereas ARFID, there's really typically not body image concerns, or if they are, it's separate from the ARFID diagnosis. It's not necessarily derived from the ARFID diagnosis. So sometimes you can find eating disorder treatment that does include ARFID work, especially at the higher level of care. If somebody has, medical needs and they need to be supervised and they need help making sure they're getting adequate intake just on a real medical level. But the other arena, which is the arena I work in, is the anxiety disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder treatment domain. And a lot of the treatments that work for OCD and anxiety disorders are really helpful for ARFID. And the big area that I work in is cognitive behavioral therapy, and a section of that is something called exposure therapy, which is where you essentially work through feelings of anxiety or distress by practicing going towards it in small, manageable ways and learning how to cope with it and challenging beliefs you might have about it or fears you might have about it, and also learning about your skills in recovering from that distress. And that can be extremely helpful for ARFID. So usually with treatment, we're trying to identify what are the things that you're dealing with when it comes to food. If it's certain textures, how can we practice going towards some of those textures in small, manageable ways where you feel confident, you're building a sense of power and agency, and you're also learning how to work through any negative or unwanted feelings that come up around it. And you get to see how it goes. Because sometimes people have these predicted feelings. This is going to be horrible. I can't handle this. This is too scary. And then afterward, they get to see that they did handle it. So you're testing out some of the beliefs along the way. And sometimes people predict they don't like something, but they've never tried it before. And when they do try it, they realize they do like it. That's not everybody with ARFID, but I definitely have a subset of people who just have avoided food for so long, they don't even know what a lot of things really taste like.
Right.
But there's also, you want to identify what the core fear is. So if it's a fear of eating across settings, we want to target eating in different settings. If it's a fear of mixing foods together or having them touch, let's practice having foods touch. If it's a fear of certain flavors, let's chain different foods in together. And you see this a lot in parenting in general, where you hide a food that people don't like and you combine it with something that they do like broccoli and cheese. And then over time, you fade out the cheese, and a kid is like, okay, I can handle broccoli. I don't love broccoli, but I can eat it without cheese. But if cheese gets it in there, then let's get it in the body because that still counts as nutrition.
Very interesting. When I was reading over about ARFID and about in your YouTube video, and I was like, wow, you could almost take the word selective mutism and interchange it, because my approach to selective mutism is one, understanding what the specific social communication challenges are and what their whys are. But the social communication bridge breaks down communication into steps. It's nonverbal, transitional, and the different aspects that can then be broken down to verbal, quiet one or two words, to regular volume, elaborative, initiative. You break it all down. So you're doing the same thing and using feelings. I'm really big with using feelings, and kids create their 0 to 3 scale for little guys and the 0 to 5 scale for older kids, teens, and adults, where we trust their feelings. We build that connection of trust, because we can't do this, do that, and talk to them that way. It's kind of a collaborative. It's a collaborative interaction with them. It's valuing their feelings without shaming them and trusting their feelings. And when you really build that trust of what their fears are, in this case with the different eating aspects and the different worries they have, it's no different than with selective mutism. Obviously, strategies change, right, based on their needs, but it's the same thing. So I love that. And you were talking about like your change one variable at a time. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. And it is that stepped approach of we want to set manageable, achievable goals and take our comfort zone and just take one step outside of it and let the comfort zone adjust. And then take another step outside of it and let the comfort zone adjust. And now we have a comfort zone that's 2 steps bigger. And we didn't have to jump very far to get there. You just have to do it one step at a time and help somebody feel like they have agency and power in that process, that they're being listened to and acknowledged and their fears are supported, and but also being encouraged to step outside of those fears or face those fears. And so one way I like to do this in a stepwise fashion is, if you don't feel like you can eat a piece of food, how can we just be around it? Can you touch it? All right, we're going to hold it. We're going to play with it. We're going to mess with it. Now, can you smell it? Can you lick it? Can you hold it in your mouth and spit it out? Can you hold it in your mouth for 5 seconds and then spit it out? And we always set up a plan beforehand and we stick with that plan. It's not we do something until you can't take it anymore, because that tends to reinforce the fear and distress associated with that experience. Instead, we want to always end on a win, and we want to follow through on what our goal is. And that plays into rescuing with parents, because if you suddenly change the goal halfway through and you rescue a kid that is distressed, you are telling that kid, you can't do this. Right. You should be afraid. And also, if you get upset enough, we don't have to do it at all. Right. You can avoid it forever. So this is the piece of, we want to set piecemeal manageable goals. And if you struggle, maybe we can go back a step, but we're not going to avoid it altogether.
So do you create various game charts and charts for the kids so they know what, when, and where? Because that's a big part of treating selective mutism, in my opinion, is giving the control to that individual struggling. So they know what, when, where, and how, and that control and understanding fuels them.
Yes. I usually, before I do any exposure, we set up exactly what the plan is, what the set end, beginning and end are, what feeling you're practicing staying with, and what you're going to do to fulfill that. And also, what are you going to be rewarded with at the end? If it's a kid, I always want to reward somebody for trying, not succeeding, but for trying, because
Right.
that's the thing we're trying to encourage, is facing that disgust or discomfort and working through it versus having to do it well. That's not the key here. But often with games, I love games, especially with kids and teens, to be honest, is and adults. Adults love games too.
Yeah, we
Is
love Babe.
I want them to be in charge of it. They design it. They are the one choosing what the exposures are. And then it's not just me telling them what to do, which a lot of people have experienced food as somebody else demanding that. And there's a lot of expectations and a lot of pressure to do it a certain way. And then they're in treatment because somebody else told them to be there, especially if it's kids. But if they can choose what the game is going to be, what the rules are, I don't care if the rules make sense. With kids, the rules don't make any sense. They usually tell me how a game works, and I'm like, all right, that's not how this is played, but this is what you said, so we're going to play it that way. And
Yeah.
apparently you're the winner every single time, and that's fine with me, because it's not about the game. It's about what helps you feel like you have some say in it, some participation in it, and then you know exactly how it's going to go. So if it's every 2 moves you take a bite, or every time you get a match in this card game you take a bite, now you know what the expectations are, and it's not going to change. It's not a moving target. And I like to give them the choice to say no to things, and it's not going to be penalized, that's going to be respected. But if they go towards something, then they can earn something. So it's more, if you do this, then you can earn this thing. If you
Right.
don't do it, that's totally fine. That's your choice. You don't have to do it. But how can we sweeten the deal a little bit? Because I'm asking you to do something that's horrible. So
Yeah.
what do you want to get out of this experience?
Right. And using their feelings to rate and grade. The external motivation for the younger folks definitely works. But what I find is, and I'm sure you do too with this and the anxieties disorders you treat, is that as they get older, their buy-in is tougher, but it also we're very dependent on them now. Whereas younger folks, it's the parent changes where the child makes the changes. But as they age, as you know, their internal motivation has to play a role. So
Mm-hmm.
how do you deal with some of the teens and adults where their family members are like, look, this is an issue, and they're like, leave me alone, I don't want to do this? Or do you find that these other reasons of the social consequences, the medical consequences, that's enough for a lot of the teens and adults? What do you find with that internal motivation playing a role?
Teens and adults are my favorite. That is who I'm usually working with. I actually don't work as much with kids as I do with teens and adults. And because they have some agency, because they have some say, and because they're often able to recognize those higher order goals. And for teens, it's probably less nutrition and more the social element, or being able to travel. And just to put it in context, I work with a lot of teens who will travel and not be able to eat anything the whole time. I had one teen that went on a trip with their family and only ate string cheese from Starbucks the entire time. It could only be from Starbucks. So that's part of the piece of ARFID that looks a little more on the obsessive compulsive domain, and why those treatments are helpful. Of, can we practice eating string cheese from somewhere else, and how do we work through that? But as a result, they got really constipated. And
Yeah,
that's
I
a
was
feeling
going
they
to
didn't.
say, wow.
Yeah, that nobody wants to experience that. And so in the moment when they're struggling, helping them remember what their higher order goals are. Because it's really hard to eat something that's disgusting and be like, yeah, I'm going to think about all the ways this is going to add to my life. Usually there's just this gut reaction of, nope, I don't want to do this. This is awful. I can't. And so we revisit, okay, what can you do? And also, what are your personal goals? So with teens in particular, I usually review that at the top of the session of, what are your goals? Why are we doing this? So that they can remember that they're the ones that set it. It's not here because I want them to eat stuff. We're here because they want to be able to eat stuff. What can they get out of it? And then just kind of reminding them of their past successes as well can help them feel confident, and like they can go towards things when they have the hard moment in session. And then I give them homework between sessions, and they can come back and tell me like, I did this and this was great and I had this hard challenge and I worked through it. So it's them being reminded of what they're hoping to get out of it. But usually they're able to identify those larger goals.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I can see that. That's, obviously the same thing. What are your goals? And even if they can't accomplish them yet, at least that we're getting them to think about what they might want to do and how that will help in their life. I know we're talking about so many different things and we probably could go on forever. I'd love for you to touch on kind of the parental rescue. That's something we all in the field of selective mutism, relate to. And it's interesting because parents don't realize how they do rescue. I don't do that. I don't do that. They either rescue or they push. It's the in between that we need to work with. And I talk about the selective mutism triangle a lot and how to bring kids into, or teens, and how to bring them into social communication, how to step back, front line, engaging, hand over table. There's so many different strategies. But I want to hear from you about the rescue in ARFID and how this occurs. I've got a lot of things that I got from the reading I did, and it's amazing how similar it is in terms of SM too.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of overlap. And I think a lot of it has to do with the broad theme of anxiety playing a role in all of these different concerns. With anxiety and anxiety disorders, parenting behaviors that are typically very kind, thoughtful, supportive behaviors are actually getting in the way. And so part of it is really learning as a parent, what are the ways that I am jumping in that is getting in the way of this kid learning that they can handle it themselves. They're learning how to work through it. They're learning how to face the fear, and they're learning how to sit through a hard moment. And for parents, it's often sitting with their own anxiety of, I feel like my child is suffering and I'm just standing on the sideline while they're suffering when I could do something to help them. But in the moment, if you're jumping in when a child is struggling with some of these anxiety concerns, that kid isn't learning how to work through it on their own. So they're not getting that experience, they're not getting that expertise, and they're also getting signaled to an extent that mom and dad don't believe I can do this. They think that this is not something I am capable of, or they're learning that if I don't want to do something, if I just wait it out long enough, or I cry hard enough, or I throw a big enough tantrum, maybe they'll come in and they'll make it stop so that they don't have to do things. So it's reinforcing behaviors that are not necessarily helpful or adaptive in that moment. And we want to think about what we're reinforcing, which is why I said, let's reward trying, because what we're trying to reinforce is that they can try things. They don't just have to say they can't, they can go towards things. And with anxiety too, often there's this danger signal that gets wildly out of control. And so if you're rescuing a kid, it's reinforcing, oh, this really was dangerous and I need to
Exactly.
be saved. It's not safe. Whereas we
Right.
want to learn, okay, this is hard, this is gross, this is uncomfortable, but it's safe.
Right. And you gave some examples that I thought were really interesting, how parents, they don't want to cause distress, that we see that a lot, right? And they might provide separate meals. So they're the child that eats different meals at the table, or they only go to the restaurant that child is comfortable at. They make the food, like you said, special, and they accommodate all that, only reinforcing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's hard when it comes to nutrition and calories, because if somebody is medically underweight, you want to get food in there no matter what. And so that can lead to a lot more accommodating because you're trying to just get food in a child's body. But sometimes we'll start off with, okay, let's eat 3 meals a day and build hunger cues and eat snacks, and then just increase the volume of the foods that are preferred to get more food in there. And then we're going to introduce foods that you don't like and just have them on the plate and normalize that they're there. And then we'll practice touching it over time and smelling it and putting it in your mouth, and just stepwise building off of that, but reducing the accommodation of, we need to have totally separate food. Especially if a kid's not medically compromised, we're going to practice eating what's prepared. And while it can feel really hard, letting a kid build up hunger to then go towards the non-preferred food can be very helpful. And so removing access to preferred foods can really help a kid want to go towards a non-preferred food, because if they can get chips, they're just going to eat that and then they won't be
Yeah.
hungry for dinner. And that's not true for every kid with ARFID, but that's one way of noticing, how am I maybe feeding into this and not helping them have the motivation to go towards things that they would otherwise not want to go towards.
And you were talking about like keeping them hungry, like not giving them in the in between. So they may be more motivated to try something. I thought that was interesting as well. This has been just so informative. I know our listeners are going to love it. We're sharing your resources at the bottom of the podcast. We're going to share it on our socials, your contact info. I know you're part of the SciPac, so different listeners in different states around the country can resource your information and consult with you. So this has been just so incredibly helpful. Is there any last minute tips or tricks that you want to share or just share with families, our listeners?
This has been awesome. I'm so appreciative to have been a part of this. And I'm just excited to lend a voice to ARFID and also acknowledge that it's a very quickly evolving community and treatment. And, things might change over the next couple of years. And I'm really excited for that.
Oh, well, I appreciate this so much. This has been just wonderful and learning from you as well. And I know our listeners are going to do the same. And I know that we have some teens and older kids also listen to the podcast. It's really cute when they'll come in and let me know what they learned in a recent podcast. So you're going to get them to listen and learn and that this is approachable, that there is a way to help, and it's great. So thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for having me.